Welcome, everyone. My name's Joseph Campana. I'm a professor of English here at Rice University. I direct the Center for Environmental Studies and co-direct our Environmental Studies curriculum. And I'm delighted to be here with you, back with many of you, I hope, for the second day of Cultures of Energy 9, New Directions in the Energy Humanities. Although our symposium is virtual, we're hosting today's event from what is now Houston, Texas. We want to acknowledge and pay our respects to the Karankawa and Atacapa Ishak people, the native peoples of today's Gulf Coast, who lived here before colonial arrivals. On their ancestral lands, we are their guests. The descendants of the Atacapa Ishak continue to make their lives in southern Louisiana and northeastern Texas. We pay, and we ask everyone today to pay, our respect to their respects to the memory of their elders. At an event I attended the other day, my colleague Jose Aranda gave a land acknowledgement that added this sentiment, which he cited as something unusual for land acknowledgements, but important for the city of Houston. And so I add that now. We ask you to join us in recognizing those US Native peoples, as well as those Native peoples who traveled here from Latin America, who have chosen to make Houston their home. We also pay our respects to the memory of their elders. And I'm also mindful of a quote by the extraordinary Aquimelodom poet Natalie Diaz. If you are where you are, then where are those who are not here? Not here. This is, as I said in my welcoming remarks yesterday, the 9th Cultures of Energy Symposium, and it marks a decade of efforts at Rice, efforts that began with a series of conversations about what humanists, architects, artists, and social scientists bring to conversations about energy that so often happen amongst engineers and policymakers. I want to welcome everyone who is back after yesterday's stellar conversations, and welcome also everyone attending for the first time for a panel I'm really excited for this morning. I want to just say a few things as we get ready for that. We had a great set of conversations yesterday, an environmental history panel called Envisioning a Warming World, a conversation about public-facing publishing in environmental and energy humanities, and also a really wonderfully sort of searching conversation with Dipesh Chakrabarty about his very recently published The Climate of History in a Planetary Age, which I conducted with my colleagues Simney Howe and Randall Hall. I want to share a few things that occurred to me along the way as I thought about those great conversations yesterday, and that might be particularly of interest for folk here today. We've been working lately on a number of initiatives in the center, and many of which are very energy focused. In light of that conversation about publishing yesterday, we've launched our own public-facing site, Correspondences, and there's particularly, just recently, an entry went up that deals with the Texas grid collapse of some weeks back. And I want to just sort of flag that for you, and you'll find a link to that appearing in the chat. I also want to say we've had all this year a webinar series called Planet Now. It's been a really wonderful occasion for bringing together a lot of different audiences, a lot of different people across disciplines, but also beyond the sort of borders of the university, to talk about important issues in environmental studies. You'll find eventually too a link to that. In particular, we had great conversations, one on futures of electricity with Leah Stokes and Akhil Gupta, and the second with my colleagues, Jim Blackburn and Daniel Cohan, also really thinking about, we'd planned the futures of electricity before we knew the grid was going to collapse in Texas. So that conversation was interestingly inflected with that what was then a very recent occurrence, and then another with Jim Blackburn and Daniel Cohan reflecting on that. Our Planet Now series will continue next year. Events are always free and open to anyone who can surf to them, and whenever we can, which is most of the time, we place the videos online for everyone to access asynchronously whenever they can. I think it's important for universities that have the wherewithal to provide as many open, free resources for anyone as they can. So we're delighted to do that. Today's lineup is as exciting as yesterday. I just want to say a little bit about it, give some thank yous, and then I want to introduce my great colleague, Gökçe Günel, who will be conducting today's conversation. We're starting in just a few moments with Emergent Ethnographies of Energy. As I said, then we'll have two other sessions at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time, a plenary conversation, Energy Humanities, What It's Been, Where It's Going, with Stephanie Lemenagere, Imre Zeman, Karen Pincus, and Dominic Boyer. And then finally at 4 p.m., my colleague Dominic will also be chairing a session on energy justice. You can register for panels. You'll get this reminder at the end again, but you can register for those panels at the link that just went up in the chat as well. Our center is located in the Schools of Humanities and Architecture. That offers us the enviable support of Deans Kathleen Canning and John Kasparian. For this conference in particular, we've received very generous funding from the Humanities Research Center, as well as from the Mellon Foundation Diluvial Houston grant, which is cited at Rice University. Behind the scenes, the folk you don't get to see, but who make everything run so smoothly, the humanities team have been extraordinary, and I just want to sort of thank John Waterhouse, Andrew Steffel, Paula Platt, Eric Granquist. And if you're seeing chats, or if you went to the session yesterday, you've already had a chance to meet Sean Smith, the Diluvial Houston project manager, who's made all of our projects run so well this year. Thanks, Sean, for everything. And finally, I want to just mention the other planners of this conference whose creativity and thoughtfulness make these sessions what they are. Gökçe Günel, who I'll introduce in a second, Dominic Boyer, Randall Hall, Simony Howe, Nikki Clements, and Gisela Hefes. So to turn to that colleague, Gökçe is in our Department of Anthropology, and we're really pleased to say she is back. And I'll mention in a moment what I mean by that. Her latest book is just plain stellar, and I'm sure many of you know it, Spaceship in the Desert, Energy, Climate Change, and Urban Design in Abu Dhabi, which focuses on the construction of renewable energy and clean technology infrastructures in the UAE, particularly in Masdar City. She's working at an even more fascinating second book project, provisionally titled Energy Accumulation, which takes a look at the unilinear logics of energy transition narratives, studying the emergence of a Turkish-built floating power plant in Ghana. Professor Günel finished her PhD at Cornell. She was a Cultures of Energy Mellon Sawyer postdoctoral fellow when SENS was just getting started. So it's so great that she's back on our faculty. She's been an ACLS new faculty fellow at Columbia University, and previously assistant professor in Middle East and North African Studies at the University of Arizona. She's widely published, an excellent teacher, and she's an innovative colleague I really cherish. So I want to turn it now over to her.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this introduction, Joe. I'm very excited to be here and very excited to be chairing this panel with Nandita Badami, Marwa Koheji, and Zeynep Oğuz, three scholars whose work I've been following for the past few years. And I'm excited to see how our conversation is going to go. And so they're all going to make 10-minute presentations and followed by a Q&A. So please participate and please ask your questions on the Q&A. And don't want to take too much of your time. So I will first introduce Nandita and then I'll introduce each of our panelists before their presentations as we go along. So Nandita Badami is a doctoral candidate in anthropology at the University of California, Irvine. Her dissertation addresses the politics of solar energy in India as the country rolls out its ambitious national solar mission. Chronicling the work of politicians, policymakers, and activists, the project engages debates in anthropology, science and technology studies, the sociology of knowledge, and political theory to chart the worlding of solar into a modern energy form. Her previous degrees include an MA and an MPhil in political theory from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Thank you so much for joining us, Nandita, and we're looking forward to your presentation. Thank
you. So I want to preface that. I'm unmuted. Okay, thanks. I wanted to preface this by saying that this is less of a presentation and more of a provocation or a thought experiment. It's what wrote itself out as I started to fill out the thing I promised Gökçe I would speak about. And so it's come out a bit abstract, and so just please bear with me. Okay. So in March 2020, India's Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change released a new draft environment impact assessment notification. So just so that we're all on the same page, an environmental impact assessment is a bureaucratic process of examining the anticipated environmental effects of a proposed infrastructural project to address possible negative environmental fallouts. The 2020 draft aims to replace the 2006 EIA notification that was in place when I was conducting fieldwork on the rollout of solar technologies in India in 2017. Back then, I discovered almost by accident that the EIA exemption, the notification in place, exempted all solar energy projects from its ambit. So this included some of the world's largest solar power plants, what India calls its ultra mega solar parks. These parks have a minimum capacity of 500 megawatts, and many of them operate between 1,000 to 2,050 megawatts of capacity, which is spread across very, very large tracts of land, between 13 to 15,000 acres each. It was striking that these solar parks did not seem to need environmental clearance because, and I don't think this audience needs me to spell this out for them, there is a lot ecologically at stake when you clear out and level that much land. Apart from the clearing of land, the disruption of groundwater runoff and underground water tables, desert ecologies often just don't get counted as such because policymakers aren't trained to think of ecologies as anything but forests, rivers, etc. All of these are reasons why this law is a bad one, of course. Any civil works project that covers 15,000 contiguous acres of land needs to be assessed for its environmental impact. But in 2017, when I encountered the law, if I'm being very honest about the cycles of academic production here, or the cycles of academic production for a grad student anyway, I didn't really sit with it or think with it very much because I thought, surely by the time I'm done writing up, this law will have come up for revision and will be changed. And so it figures in my ethnography, but I didn't really think with it. Well, I'm currently about 4 days away from submitting my dissertation as we speak. And not only has the law not changed, the new draft EIA is in tune with the Modi government's record on environmental issues, which is to say the new draft notification is worse on several counts. And although various things are suspended at the moment because of the COVID situation, it is safe to assume that when this draft is notified, it will maintain the existing exemption. So I guess the question is, how do we think with this? How do we make sense of the exemption of an ostensibly environmental technology, solar energy, from the requirement to assess its impact on the environment? What happens when the environmental becomes an a priori adjective, a quality attached to an object or a technology? Well, one of the effects, as we see in the case of the now long-standing solar exemption from EIA assessment in India, is that it can produce the following tautology. Environmental objects or technologies need not go through environmental clearance because they are environmental to begin with. I wish I could say that there's another logic animating this exemption, but there is not. It really is that basic. The political commitment, of course, is to recognize and classify this as bad policy, object to it, and to advocate for its not passing. But analytically, it might serve as a vessel through which to think through some of the structures of meaning that animate solar policy decisions. And that is what I'm going to try to do with the rest of my time, sort of think through with the rest of my time. But it's going to be a little bit abstract. So like I said, bear with me. Here is the analytic I'm playing with at the moment. And this is why this is more of a provocation or a thought experiment than a presentation. I propose that we invert the manner in which we approach the question, which is to say, normally my impulse would be to decry the EIA exemption as an instance of bad policy and critique the failure of this policy to regulate and intervene in the environment in crisis, both in an immediate sense as well as writ large. But what if we inverted the question to approach the environment not as a background condition of crisis, to which this particular policy response is no doubt inadequate, but ask instead how policies like this reveal how the environment is conceptualized by policymakers in the first place, and by extension, how solutions like solar play a role in defining the contours of the crisis into which they are seen to be intervening. So another way of putting this would be, what does it mean to declare, as the Indian government has virtually done, that solar has no environmental impact? And what might this tell us about how the environment gets defined in relation to large-scale techno solutions like solar? To answer this, to begin with, it is worth pointing out that the environment as a concept operates on two registers. As an abstraction, as well as like an immediate physical surrounding. Similarly, solar as a solution is also pitched on these two registers. It intervenes in the environment as abstraction, which is to say solar is deployed to address environmental crisis writ large, as well as to intervene in everyday immediate crises. For instance, connecting panels to a water pump to let a village without access to electricity pump water for agriculture, just to give an example from fieldwork. I'm jumping around a little bit here for time, but if we go back to the ultra mega solar parks I mentioned a few minutes ago, they are governed by state-level policies that are commonly referred to as plug and play. Plug and play policies make it easy for solar investors to invest by loosening regulatory requirements. For instance, not having to perform environmental impact assessments. I find plug and play as a phrase to be an interesting one because it indexes the modular nature of the technology. Solar panels are, in industry terms, called modules, and they are modular partly because they function with the principle of ease of assembly and can be deployed just about anywhere. Hence, plug and play. So the modular then here operates as a description of the technology itself, and also in being used to refer to a genre or policy template, it reveals something about the manner in which solar energy is imagined to interact with the environment, which is that it plugs into it in order to mitigate the negative effects of carbon emissions. Which is to say, the modular describes both the technology itself and the manner in which the connection between the environment as immediate surrounding and the environment as abstraction writ large is established. The immediate is plugged into the abstract system. Crucially, the imagination of solutions in policymaking rests on being able to intervene in both the immediate environment as well as the environment writ large. One might think that intervening in the environment as immediate must accumulate in scale to address the environment as abstraction. However, this is precisely what the EIA exemption for solar reveals does not happen. The environment as an abstraction undercuts the efficacy of environmental action at the scale of the particular, which is to say, there is no environmental impact. There is only no environmental impact in a situation where the imaginary of the environment is first and foremost abstract, delinked from the environment as immediate surrounding. And it is when policymakers imagine their solutions to be intervening in that abstraction rather than the immediate environment, that the environment is, ironically, abstracted from the calculations of what is essentially meant to be an environmental solution. As solutionism's grain ground, I think the interplay of these dual registers of the environment as abstraction and the immediate present thing around us might be something worth thinking with. To train our analytics not just to the fact of crises, but to solutions as things that affect the conceptual contours of the crises, in interpolating, in this case, one or the other register in a more heightened way. And this is just one example of how this might play out. To invert the manner in which we approach the environment as an object, not as an idea already construed out there with which we are interacting, but a thing whose conceptual edges we define as we intervene in it, is different than talking about imaginaries of the future. It is not a self-conscious imaginary of an elsewhere or another time or another way. It is a kind of epistemic contouring that is constantly taking place in the present, if somewhat innocuously. The short version of a conclusion I want to offer is to say that I think this is worth thinking with. This tension between the environment as an abstraction and the environment as an immediate register might reveal something about how we go about conceptually arranging meaning to perform the work of mitigation. The imaginaries, calculative devices, and moral frameworks we deploy to effect the reduction or reversal of harm understood to have already occurred. Both solar energy and regulatory frameworks like the EIA are mitigation technologies in their own right. And it is for this reason that it is worth exploring the manner in which they not just address crises, but also to some extent influence the frameworks through which we understand crises to begin with. Thank you.
Next, we have Zeynep Oğuz. Zeynep Oğuz is a political and environmental anthropologist specializing in the politics of natural resources and energy in the Middle East. And she's currently a postdoc in environmental humanities at Northwestern with a joint appointment at the Department of Anthropology. Zeynep holds a master's degree in anthropology from Columbia, which she finished in 2011. And she received her PhD in anthropology in September 2019 at the Graduate Center at CUNY. Zeynep's teaching focuses on contemporary culture, society, and politics of the Middle East and Turkey, energy and environmental humanities, and political anthropology and earth politics. Her essays and articles on the politics of oil and geology in Turkey have appeared in Political Geography, Cultural Anthropology, and the Middle East Report. I strongly recommend that you read her political geography piece. She's currently working on a book project on the politics of oil, geology, and territoriality in Turkey's Kurdish region. Thank you so much for joining us, Zeynep.
Thank you, Gökçe, and thank you, Joe, for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here and looking forward to the conversation after the talks. So my talk today is titled Turkey's Extractivist Frontiers, Militarized Geographies of Oil and Gas in Anatolia and the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. But I'm going to primarily talk about gas politics and the Cyprus issue today. So in August 2020, two warships, one Greek and one Turkish, crashed into one another off the east coast of Crete. Neither sank, and the collision was reportedly an accident. But both ships were projecting power over a section of the Mediterranean and its promised fossil gas reserves. Claimed by Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus as a result of the disputes over maritime borders and the Eastern Mediterranean, which is facing one of the most intense crises the region has witnessed in the previous decades. So today in this talk, I want to talk about these gas prospects and their relation to political futures in Turkey and Cyprus in relation to the Cyprus issue. It's a 4 decades old problem. So two backgrounds. In 2009, Israel discovered 3 major offshore gas fields, which were estimated to represent over 200 years worth of Israel's current natural gas consumption. Since then, the discovery of these vast reserves sparked interest from other coastal states and to explore their boundaries for potential oil and gas reserves in the seas. In 2011, oil firms announced the discovery of gas deposits in Cypriot waters in the southeastern Mediterranean Sea. And this is the complex geography, offshore geography of these deposits and claims that states are making. The discoveries have made the Eastern Mediterranean Sea a new frontier, a space of resource potentiality. They furthered new geopolitical disputes between Turkey, Cyprus, and Greece over maritime sovereignty rights and the political future of the island, which has been divided since the Turkish occupation of northern Cyprus in 1974. The disputes for Turkey were interlocked with the Cyprus issue while mediating questions and politics of territory and sovereignty. Disputes over gas exploration rights have become means of asserting geopolitical and sovereignty claims and vice versa, while framing the sea as a new frontier and militarizing the Eastern Mediterranean region at the same time. Since the Turkish occupation in 1974, the island has been divided into 2 entities. The Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus in the north, a de facto state only recognized by Turkey, and the Republic of Cyprus, which is recognized by international law and also a part of the EU. Turkey opposes the delimitation agreement signed by Cyprus with the third countries on the ground that Republic of Cyprus doesn't represent the entire island and that Turkish Cypriots have also rights in the gas discoveries. Greece argues that the Cyprus problem stems from the landing of the Turkish troops in 1974 and the solution remains in the withdrawal of the troops from the island, while Turkey claims that the issue results from the existence of 2 distinct communities on the island, as there are, and that they are ethnically, culturally, and linguistically different from each other, and argues for a 2-state solution, which is resonant of other states in the region. In the remaining part of this talk, I'm going to speak about how states and international organizations, think tanks frame the issue, but also how Cypriot communities are basically putting forward counter proposals for the political and environmental future of the island. So my observations and arguments are based on fieldwork I've conducted in Istanbul for my dissertation research on oil and geology in Turkey since 2016, and this new project on Cyprus that will be hopefully taking off since after the pandemic ends in Cyprus. So, okay. I encountered these actors for the first time in 2016 at the World Energy Congress in Istanbul. There I met the Deputy Minister of Energy and Natural Resources of Turkey, Alparslan Bayraktar. When I asked him about the prospects and political prospects, he told me that the issue was clearly about Turkey's foreign dependency on oil and gas, which is about 93 and 99% respectively. For Bayraktar, Turkey's hydrocarbon exploration activities were extremely important in order to decrease Turkey's foreign dependency. So World Energy Congress, the opening remarks also involved Erdogan, Putin, and also the president, then president of the Northern Republic of Cyprus. Another prominent actor in the debates about gas prospects in the region was Atlantic Council, a US-based think tank, pro-Atlantic alliance, trying to ensure that Turkey stays a trustworthy ally of NATO and the United States. At a panel on the Eastern Mediterranean gas politics, speakers affiliated with the organization framed the discovery of significant gas deposits in the exclusive economic zones of Israel and Cyprus as a possible energy source outside the former Soviet region and the Middle East, and therefore an opportunity for EU to diversify their natural gas supplies and again, making sure that these relations are independent of Soviet or Russian influence. In 2016-17, I volunteered at the Energy Summit in Istanbul, which was organized by the Atlantic Council. The speakers in these panels recast the Mediterranean Sea as a new space of resource potentiality. One speaker, a politics analyst at the Atlantic Council, for example, started her talk as follows. Unlike the Gulf of Mexico or the North Sea, the Mediterranean Sea has always been better known for its stunning climate, cuisine, and a booming tourism trade rather than offshore oil and gas. But as easy oil becomes an increasingly rare prospect, and as productivity in mature regions such as the North Sea continues to decline, exploration firms are pushing their search for hydrocarbons into deeper waters and in territories that previously hadn't been considered. In that context, oil and gas resources in the Mediterranean have become more attractive in the last decade, pulling investment like never before. So the panelists seem to think that the gas discoveries in the Eastern Mediterranean would serve as a trigger for peace and collaboration, cooperation, and as a catalyst for the resolution of a number of the region's conflicts, most notably the Cyprus one. In a bunch of reports published in 2017 and 18, PRIO, a peace and conflict resolution research institute based in Oslo, asserted that hydrocarbons that remain in the ground are of use to no one. And they can be, they claimed, a platform for cooperation between the states and people in the region. So multiple resource determinisms and fetishisms are going on here. By 2019, however, they seem to have grown pessimistic about the power of gas deposits. If poorly managed, another report by PRIO stated, gas discoveries have an equal capacity to intensify existing tensions or create new ones. Especially in the case of Cyprus, this seems to have been the case so far, the author concluded. So Geopolitical discourses on the Cyprus conflict are dominated by security approaches that take existing political units and competing interests in the region for granted, and they emphasize ethnic or religious conflict and competing nationalism on the island. But as anthropologists and critical geopolitics scholars argue, depictions of world politics by politicians and policymakers usually take limited ethnocentric views that naturalize and justify warfare and exploitation. And in the case of Cyprus, they also naturalize the prospect of resource extraction, but ecological crisis facing the planet require radical shifts from the conventional worldviews that geopolitics, security, and extractivism rely on. And similarly, discussions on the Cyprus issue dismiss participatory approaches and what the communities of Cyprus think. They rarely explore what Cypriots, the Turkish and Greek inhabitants of the entire island envision for their environmental and political futures in the wake of these discoveries. They also dismiss a long tradition of internationalist, federalist, and pro-unification movements in Cyprus that claim basically for a non-interventionist politics and a future that is not dictated by the UN, Europe, Turkey, and Greece. So I am curious about what Cypriots want to do with the hydrocarbons under the seabed and what kinds of political and territorial arrangements do these visions entail, and how they are recasting their political and environmental visions in relation to hydrocarbon discoveries in the Mediterranean Sea. There are multiple movements that have emerged in the last decade: Unite Cyprus Now, Friends of Cyprus, Stop EastMed, and Kazma Bırak, which is Keep It Under the Ground. So these are from 2 weeks ago during held in Cyprus during the Geneva meetings, unofficial Geneva meetings, trying to come up with a two-state solution. And these are movements that are arguing for a united federal Cyprus. This is a youth organization, HADE, a multi-communal youth initiative, trying to forge alliances and relations between Greek-speaking and Turkish-speaking Cypriots. So these movements frame war as an ecological problem. They connect different scales, ethics and politics, regional, planetary, and so forth. They point to possible futures beyond extractivism, military occupation, and ethnic and religious conflicts. And they argue that the future of Cyprus rests on leaving natural gas, fossil gas deposits under the ground and forging a multi-communal, bi-communal future for the entire island. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all our panelists. I'm going to take advantage of my role as chair and ask 3 questions to each of our panelists. So I may ask a question to each of our panelists. So I'll start with Nandita. I'm curious, Nandita, to hear a little bit more about how I like your conception of the environment as a sort of abstraction, and environment as a sort of immediate register very much. And I just wanted to know if you could say something about how how these 2 registers come to be known. How do you think they come to be represented, and how do these 2 understandings or 2 epistemic categories circulate as categories amongst your interlocutors?
So India is actually very, I think so if you follow Indian environmental politics, you will realize that there's a lot of effort that's taken to index a kind of commitment to the abstract environmental, whether it's for instance, in terms of the targets. So India in 2014, declared that it tripled its solar installation targets overnight, and declared that it would install 100 gigawatts of energy by 2022, which of course is not happening, and that's an entirely different story. But there are these grand statements made. The other example is the International Solar Alliance, which is group of countries that ostensibly fall between the tropics of Cancer and the tropics of Capricorn. So basically the countries that have sunlight, that are imagined to challenge the monopoly of OPEC as a way of organizing countries and using sort of, if OPEC has a monopoly over oil, the International Solar Alliance is imagined to have some kind of control over sunlight as countries that like have sunlight, right? So these are ways in which like I think of these as like very abstract commitments to abstraction, in that sense, like to intervene in the environmental crisis in this like abstract way. But very often during fieldwork, when you sort of come across policies that undercut like things that are supposed to be environmental, for instance, the environmental impact assessment that accepts solar energy because like solar is understood to be environmental, that's basically like the place in which I situate myself as like thinking about these problems. Like how do you make sense of wanting to plug into, and I'm using the word plug into very specifically because it is like modular, right? It's coming from the imagination of this technology that you can just plug in anywhere and get energy. And sorry, just to not, this is like a long answer, but just to clarify, this like commitment to think with modularity is coming from like a desire to think about connection beyond flows. Because like when we think about oil, most commonly, like there is flow, like oil flows and you're following oil. And so there's a way that I want to say, well, the modularity of the technology, like almost like, you know, this idea that you can just plug things into like as solutions is something that I want to explore. So it's not like it's not a well-defined theory or anything like that. It's just like an idea that I'm playing around with. And so it's that, it's I think that very often the immediate environment is imagined to just like plug into the abstract environment, but in like a very weirdly problematic way, where that like the desire for that to contribute to or like plug that thing into the abstraction that is the environment undercuts like, you know, what is actually good for the environment, because, you know, like large scale solar parks actually have major impacts on like groundwater, for instance, that nobody talks about, because you just imagine, oh, you can like plug these things, you can like level the land, put a bunch of solar panels on it, and like there you go, mitigation has happened. So that's the kind of thing I'm trying to like think with.
Thank you so much, Nandita, for this answer.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if Mara was available here. I'll ask a final question to Zeynep, and I see there's one question on the Q&A window here that I'll read to you guys after my question to Zeynep. So in your presentation, Zeynep, I think it was very interesting to see how there's a sort of almost a unified front amongst the sort of the Turkish and Greek-speaking Cypriots against the extraction of gas. And I wondered if this has something to do with what's going to happen to the extracted gas afterwards. So how is it going to be used? Where is it going to be on the market? And how is it going to circulate beyond the moments of its extraction? So and I'm not sure if you've done any research on that, but I'd be very curious to hear that, and if there's any relationship between that process and the reaction that that you've been observing amongst the Cypriots. Thank you.
So there are a few pipeline projections, and if I could share my screen briefly, I can show it. And so this is the Eastern Mediterranean proposed pipeline that will start in Israel and then pass through Cyprus to Greece and then to Italy. And through Italy to the rest of European Union. And Turkey wanted to basically be in this game and propose different kinds of pipelines, which would be shorter and, according to Turkey's argument, much cheaper, to basically start in Cyprus and pass through Turkey and then through Turkey to either Bulgaria or Greece. So there were all these competing pipeline projections, and especially in 2016-17, when Turkish military aggression wasn't this intense yet, and when Atlantic Council and other international NGOs were really trying to push Turkey, make Turkey an ally and a player in their language in this pipeline politics, there was a possibility that could be realized. But now Israel, Greece, and Italy have signed bilateral agreements for this pipeline construction that is basically excluding Turkey completely. So this is the project now, and there are also these movements basically based in Europe that are arguing to stop this construction, which is not happening, by the way. It's so expensive with the oil prices dropping. It's not economically viable right now to try to extract these resources and build a pipeline. So these movements are arguing that, first of all, Europe doesn't need that much gas. Second of all, they are emphasizing how this pipeline will help Israel continue its occupation in Palestine. So it will enable the Mediterranean Sea to be even more militarized. And also like linking other kinds of pipeline projects, how they help militarization, how they help depoliticization at the same time. They are really like helping forging these connections between how energy is fetishized, how certain energy determinisms, resource determinisms legitimize ongoing occupation, Turkish occupation, including in Cyprus. So all these movements in Cyprus, so whatever happens, the pipeline will go through Cyprus if it's built. But obviously, this is how politics of future works, right? These prospects have immediate effects in the present, even if they're realized or unrealized. So it will go through Cyprus, that's the plan, and it will exclude Turkey. So they are saying that we want to have a say as communities of Cyprus, as peoples of Cyprus. We don't want states or companies to have ownership. We want these resources to basically belong to the peoples of Cyprus. So like nationalized in a way, and we want to leave them under the ground after they are nationalized. So that is like their basically line of thinking.
Thank you so much. So I'll start with the first question from the Q&A window. And this question is directed to all of our panelists. Can the panel discuss disconnects in aims and goals with respect to energy transitions away from oil between leaders / rulers and their respective populations? And is there a recognition of the need to adjust to localities of production and usage instead of the current oil producers of the world stance / mentality? So whoever wants to start, take the lead.
I think there's many parts to this question, but I could address some of it. One, so at the very end, I think Mike Vessels, who asked this question, says, is there a recognition of the need to adjust localities of production and usage instead of current oil producers of the world? And I think I made a very quick and dirty reference to precisely this happening in relation to solar energy, with this thing that they call the Environmental Solar Alliance. So I don't want to give it more importance than it deserves, because I think of it as something that the Modi government put together as a way of leveraging and leveraging a kind of commitment to solar energy that then allows India to consume the amount of coal that it does. So like, given that that's what I think the politics of the International Solar Alliance is, conceptually it is interesting because it does precisely this. It questions, it tries to shift the terms of geopolitics. So if so far you have OPEC that has controlled energy prices in the world, and OPEC are obviously energy producing countries, the International Solar Alliance, by sort of bringing together countries between the Tropics of Cancer and the Tropics of Capricorn as a group, try and think about countries as consumers of sunlight. So most countries between the tropics are quote unquote third world countries, which means that they do not produce the technology, but they are the major buyers or consumers of solar technologies. And so the idea in forming an alliance was originally to be able to control markets for the technology, which is to say, like, if India joins with South Africa and like puts in a really big order for solar panels, the price of those panels will drop, right? So there's a way that there's an imagination of how to shift the terms of geopolitics towards like thinking about the way that we consume sunlight. I don't know if this answers Mike Vessel's question in its entirety, but yeah, this does happen, at least in like the alternative energy universe. People are trying to think of how localities of usage sort of shift instead of production. Yeah.
Thank you, Nandita. Zeynep or Marwa, would you like to jump in?
I can say a few things, but my dog is angry at something right now. So for Cyprus, these questions are ultimately linked to the future of this problem, that Northern Cyprus is occupied and unrecognized. So any kind of, and Republic of Cyprus basically signed the Paris Agreement, but Turkey hasn't. So first of all, that is causing this dissonance in different parts of the island. Whatever is done in southern Cyprus doesn't have any effect. Maybe I'll respond in a little bit. I'm ready. So yeah, to summarize what I was talking about is the energy future is interlocked with the political question and the occupation of Northern Cyprus. Which makes any kind of green transition or whatever that means impossible for Northern Cypriots to initiate, because they are very energy dependent, financially dependent on Turkey, because they're not recognized by the international community. Northern Cyprus has a serious water problem, and Turkey uses resources as a leverage for Cyprus. As recently as 3 years ago, Turkey built a massive tunnel between Mersin and Cyprus that is delivering water to Cyprus. And 2 years ago, when Cypriots were protesting Turkish involvement, and the then president was also advocating for the end of Turkish occupation, Turkey threatened Cyprus, and they said, we will cut your water if you keep acting like this. So it's really holding energy and resources as leverage over Cypriots, and really blocking any kind of transition or politics of the otherwise. And Turkey is still mining coal in its own territories. It is diversifying. It is adopting a pro-climate change mitigation discourse, but it is basically doing whatever it wants. This is the first issue. But there is also, for Cypriots, the hypocrisy of Europe and European Union. And Cypriots say, okay, the European Union countries may have signed the Paris Agreement, but these are not enough for change. They are still mining coal. They are still contributing to these natural fossil gas projects, which are not the solution to this problem. So Cypriots are also pointing at the hypocrisy of EU while pointing at Turkey at the same time. And there are proposals for basically switching to constructing solar panels, because Cyprus is for them a really perfect place for solar energy. But these are all dependent on the political unification of the island. So it's really deadlock. Through the politics and energy futures really depend on each other, and it really depend on the end of occupation.
Thank you so much, Zeynep. There's a question for Nandita. Kamala Visveswaran is asking if Nandita could say more about the environmental impact of solar energy upon groundwater. What are the specific environmental effects of large solar panels being placed in desert regions? And to what extent do we need to understand the exemption in the regulation being due to the fact that the same companies that control non-renewable energy development are also key investors in solar? So the exemption becomes a loophole for the same company to exploit for other energy investments. Thank you, Nandita.
Yes, this is a really good question, and it's making me want to apologize for having jumped over so much detail in my presentation. The environmental impact of solar energy upon groundwater is not something that's discussed very frequently, but is a major issue not discussed frequently in industry, but is a major issue amongst activists. So because I had a heads up about the question, I pulled up some of the statistics. The basic way to understand this is that deserts are dusty. I think Marva also mentioned this in one of her responses. Most of the places that if we have large solar parks in India are also sort of fallow land, uncultivated land. They're supposed to be installed on land that is not otherwise thought of as productive. Usually these are sort of desert or desertified areas, and these are dusty areas, which means that the panels get covered by a film of dust, which means that they need to be cleaned. And that, when you think of parks the size of 15,000 acres of land, that's a lot of water that is required. So I just pulled up what I have by way of figures, and each megawatt worth of panels requires between 7,000 to 20,000 liters of water per wash. So this is a figure that I got from an environmental activist agency that put together this. So it's obviously what happens in real life. 1 megawatt, anywhere between 7,000 to 20,000 liters of water to clean. And remember, these are minimum 500 megawatts of energy, each park, but they sometimes go up to 2,050 megawatts of energy. So it's 1 megawatt can take 20,000 liters of water. And where is this water coming from? It's just of course, all these solar energy companies just put up little wells and they draw water from the ground. And so this is and I should mention that this is not priced into the price of solar, the price of water, because these solar energy companies have access to land. And the land is priced, but the water beneath the land is actually not priced, and so it's not taken in. So it's actually a scandal. So that was part one of the question. Part two, which is to what extent do we need to understand the exemptions in the regulation, being due to the fact that some companies do both, right? And of course, Adani is a very famous company that does both coal and solar. And I think the way that I understand these exemptions, so I don't think Adani, for instance, would benefit from the solar loophole for coal specifically. How I understand it is that the loophole makes solar zones, and this is a policy term that's sort of used in notification documents. Solar zones become like special economic zones. It's essentially the same word is used, like zone as is in zoning, and all of the sort of work that is, all of the academic work that has been done on sort of zoning speaks to both things. And so the solar zone is modeled on the special economic zone as a place of like exemption, as like a place where companies can just come and do their thing and not actually have to deal with the legal regulatory environment that everyone else has to. And so that's how I understand it. I haven't come across sort of a company like Adani, benefiting from the loophole for coal. But it's modeled on the special economic zone as far as I can tell. Yeah, so thank you for that question.
Thank you, Nandita. We have a question from Karen Pincus for all the panelists. Karen says, wonderful presentations. I have a methodological question for any or all of the panelists that concerns the applicability of your research beyond the local to the larger or global. Do you feel any imperative to make general claims for the really interesting terms you employ? And if so, when in the process, defining a research field, doing field work, writing up your findings, does this imperative kick in?
I mean, I could start, but I don't want to monopolize the response. Okay. So thank you, Karen. That's a very interesting question. And as someone who has literally just written the introduction of my dissertation, I feel like the answer to this question is at the very end. When you're like looking back and you're like, oh, how did that work out methodologically? And so the reason. So one of the things that I sort of bumped up against while writing the introduction, so I was reading Dipesh Chakravarti's most recent book, as sort of I published in January, and I was reading it as I prepared to write my introduction. And so it's interesting that you use the phrase your like applicability of your research beyond the local to the larger or global. Because when I read that book, I didn't read the entire book, I'm going to be honest, I read the introduction in the first chapter, but when I read it, I was struck by the category of the planetary instead of the global. And the way, I started thinking about the way that all of us, I mean, everyone within the energy or everyone on the panel at least, very likely sort of started off their research within a context where their interventions were being made in relation to the global. But by the time we finish writing up our research, our interventions are being made in relation, or we're caught between the global and the planetary in a sense. I think for me specifically, I was thinking about the way that, because I think I'm trying to think with modularity as against flows and following. And since you're sort of talking about, since you ask about like research methods specific, I think you asked about research methods. I like at some point while writing the introduction, I realized that I've been struggling with the idea of following solar energy, because the way that we imagine our projects as following something implies that they flow. And like sunlight fundamentally does not do this. But which is why I think I tried to think with like the modular nature of the technology itself, and how there's like a way that modularity forms a kind of template of connection that is not flow. Insofar as as far as like anthropology is concerned, the global as a framework is something that we access through flow and following, which came about in the 1990s when George Marcus was like, talking about following as a way of intervening in the global. right? Because globalization had flows. So what do we do when our objects don't flow? Or, I mean, this is all just is very, very nascent. But I think there's a way that the planetary, when you start thinking about the Earth as Earth system in relation to Earth system science, where system is a very specific concept, that I encounter is in solar energy a lot, because solar energies are solar systems in that sense, and like the modular fits into the system. I actually found that modularity helps me think about relation beyond flow, in a way that speaks to the planetary, because suddenly, because we're thinking about Earth system and not just the global. So sorry, that was very complicated, maybe not very clear answer, but those are the initial thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen. And also, Nandita, your mentioning of the planetary, thinking about these kinds of scales, that is actually what is really framing my approach to what's going on in Cyprus, that these kinds of politics are immediately planetary. And this exercise my students did last week is a version of Joe Dumit's implosion project, but really thinking about, they picked like one object, a coal, a lithium battery, and really thinking about the planetary in that object, and the object and how that object flows, appears in the planet as well. So like really, when Cypriots are saying, let's leave these hydrocarbons under the seabed, this is an ontological statement about really rethinking what these materials are, not as resources, but as something else. And I'm thinking about Zoe Todd's recent articles on really thinking about fossil fuels as weaponized kin, without reciprocity. So there are all these histories, geological histories of gas formation when we are talking about gas projects, dating back to Eocene, for example. There is the formation of the island of Cyprus, its own geological history. I'm thinking about Caribbean poetry and Elizabeth Delorey's work on islands as planetary spaces. So in a way, these politics, arguments, conflicts around energy are geopolitical conflicts, but in the sense, geo as Earth, they are Earth politics. They are really debates about what Earth, the planet is, and how it can be otherwise. So in a way, all these so-called local concerns are deeply planetary, and they resonate with a lot of politics, conflicts going on all around the world. And that's why these movements are also in solidarity with other kind of politics that are against fracking or gas development, but also colonialism and occupation in the Middle East, or Canada and other parts in North America. So they're really acutely aware that these problems are interlinked. The question of colonialism, geology, and resources are one and only thing. And this is like, we have to imagine another Earth politics. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Zeynep. We have one last question from Nathan Stino. His first question is for Zeynep. Is a comparative framework useful for understanding Cyprus's experience with hydrocarbon development and negotiation over the future of Cypriot states? Do other examples, South Sudan, Iraq, etc., suggest that hydrocarbon development tends to consolidate or fragment national states? And he also has a question for Marwa. Have there been any alternative design proposals in Bahrain for non-mechanical cooling? For instance, I recall the Egyptian architect Hassan Fatih incorporated wind catches and other cooling features into low-cost vernacular architecture. Thank you so much for your question, Nathan.
So there are comparisons, and especially people pro-gas development talk about positive developments, how resources fuel peace and cooperation. So they come up with a bunch of examples. And on the contrary, opposing that, anti-gas development people, climate activists, talk about Syria, pipelines in Syria as the drivers of conflict, and talk about how pipelines cause militarization, centralization. This is an argument made for example, nuclear energy as well, that any kind of nuclear energy development requires centralization, authoritarianism, and militarized rule. So do artifacts have politics is the question here. But I am more interested in how these kinds of proposals seem to sort of depoliticize what's at stake sometimes and fetishize energy systems and resources as like, okay, like it's kinds of oil curse argument imported to gas, for example. And then it becomes like, are pipelines fueling conflict? So where are the people? Where are people's own projects? Where are their own political visions? So I am really interested in how these kinds of energy resource fetishisms are employed by certain actors. Even climate change activists claiming that resources, gas development will cause more militarization is, I think, interesting because also I'm interested in for example, solar development projects, which sometimes tend to replicate extractivist politics, extractivist visions. So like renewable energy is not in and of itself a democratic, egalitarian energy source or infrastructure. Politics matter, and it is composed, right, by people in the now. So I'm really interested in how these kinds of determinisms, fetishisms are employed and what they conceal at the same time or bring about.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left, and we have one question from Nikki Clements for all the panelists. So Nikki says, really fascinating panel, thank you so much. I'm wondering how the Earth geopolitics just mentioned can be navigated in relation to national boundaries. The logic of boundaries has been so often used to dominate and exclude. Can we rethink boundaries in order to protect and recognize disparities until more equitable practices shape all policies? And Nikki continues, I'm thinking about extractive practices such as DAPL as disowning boundaries when it suits them and further violates the land of indigenous people, or even the way that environmental protections are being repealed federally in a way that affects people's communities. Thank you, Nikki. Anyone want to jump in?
I can say a few words maybe. Yeah, this is a great point and a great question because elements and workings of the planet defy these boundaries. A sandstorm, a dust storm formed in China ends up in California, the particles in that dust storm, and it affects bodies, environments in uncontrollable ways. So at the one hand, there is this kind of urge to defy these boundaries. But also when you think about a dust storm or a toxic element making its way through borders, there is also this urge to basically control what gets in and what gets out. So this is like a politics of both drawing lines and a politics of entanglement. What do we, this is like a philosophical question for environmental thought, ecological thought, and political thought. Like, what kind of relations do we want? What kind of relations we want to stay out of? Which elements do we want to get entangled with? And which ones that are toxic to human bodies and elsewhere, right? So, this is like a question about both politics and ethics. And just like Cypriots argue that they are basically Cyprus is divided into two, but ecologically it is a one land piece, right? And what happens in south affects what happens in north. So there is, on the one hand, this urge to for deterritorialization, debordering, but also it's a philosophical question of how to also navigate these boundaries, because a boundless world reminds us that humans are very vulnerable to the workings of the Earth system and how Earth system responds to human workings of capitalist, colonialist extraction and the waste that it generates. So this is like a messy world right now with toxins and other kinds of things that harm us. So navigating that is probably one of the most important ethical and political questions of our times.
Apologies.
Thank you, Marwa. Nandita, you can respond briefly if you'd like.
I mean, if we have time?
Yeah, sure.
I would keep it really short, which is to say that I went through a phase where I was thinking about solar in relation to sovereignty a lot, because it gets mobilized in that discourse, like no one can embargo the sun. I think that that's like a line by like a US president, and I'm forgetting which one right now, but like that idea that no one can embargo the sun, and therefore, you know, national interests, like it's like you should invest in solar for the national interest, is an interesting one, because so simultaneously there's this idea that no one can embargo the sun, but also like for a while now there's like a tradition of thinking about solar as precisely like sunlight is everywhere, and thinking of I'm thinking of like Buckminster Fuller's global energy grid, or the Desertec Foundation energy grid, which of course has not been made yet, but like wants to channel solar energy from like the northern Africa into Europe. Or most recently, like Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, sort of spoke about the idea of one world, one sun, one grid. And like all of these are things, statesmen say these things as a way of like eroding boundaries, but like you really, just as like Desertec shows us, like, there's always a politics there that, is obviously going to map on to existing geopolitics, however much there is a desire to read sunlight as something that can unify, because it exists everywhere and erodes boundaries. So yeah, that would be my response. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Nandita. I mean, thank you all three of you for wonderful presentations and this wonderful discussion. I learned a lot from this panel, and so we have to unfortunately finish our panel now, but there's going to be another panel starting at 2 p.m. So please join us for our next session at 2 p.m. Central Time. And you can see on the chat window here a registration link if you haven't registered already. So thank you so much, and see you in the next session.